During House floor remarks earlier this month, Congressman David Cicilline spoke in strong support of the Speak Out Act. The bill aims to protect survivors of sexual assault by banning the use of forced non-disclosure agreements. NDAs have been notoriously used by those in positions of power to cover up workplace harassment. Cicilline expressed his disappointment in Republicans who did not support the bill, but have spoken in support of survivors in the past, like Ranking Member of the Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jim Jordan. The bill passed later that day, with a vote count of 315 to 109.
Saying that this bill is proof of the extraordinary leadership of Chairman Nadler on the Judiciary Committee. He has led our committee in a principled, determined way, and I think as a result of his leadership, the Judiciary Committee has been the most productive, impactful, and effective committee in the Congress. And while my colleagues on the other side of the aisle look forward to a different chairman, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary leadership of our current chairman. Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of S. 4524, the Speak Out Act. And I want to applaud the sponsor, Ms. Frankel, Mr. Buck, and all the other bipartisan leaders who are part of this effort, including you, Madam Speaker. This common sense legislation will prevent the enforcement of pre-dispute non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements in sexual harassment and sexual assault disputes. It will ensure that any survivor who wants to share their story without fear of judicially enforced reprisals can do so. And in fact, it's unthinkable, I hope to all of us, that widespread sexual misconduct can be covered up and swept under the rug because of NDAs snuck into these take-it-or-leave-it contracts. And it's well beyond time for this abusive practice to end. Enacting the Speak Out Act will bring sunlight and transparency to a system that relies on the shadows to hide horrific conduct. It will make our society more just. It will help end the culture of silence that allows predators to evade accountability. And I look forward to sending this bill to the President's desk and taking another step in our critical and ongoing work to eliminate the forced silence that prevents survivors of sexual misconduct from having their voices heard. Before closing, I want to address the argument raised by some of my Republican colleagues that the Speak Out Act interferes with the rights of states to establish their own laws on this issue. They're missing the point. This legislation protects an American value by prohibiting survivor censorship and defending the freedom of survivors to tell their own stories. This baseline freedom should not vary from state to state. And finally, I want to say that the Speak Out Act creates a floor for the basic protection of survivors' rights to speak out, not a ceiling. States remain free to enact stronger protections for survivors. And according to reports, 15 states have done just that, with some states like California banning the use of NDAs entirely. But federal legislation is still necessary because survivors should not have to rely on a patchwork of varying states, uncertain which might apply to them. And finally, I want to end by noting that I'm a little bit confused and, I'll be honest, disappointed by the opposition I've heard from some of my Republican colleagues in light of their previous statements. For example, during consideration of legislation that prohibited the enforcement of forced arbitration clauses in these same kinds of cases, Mr. Jordan, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, said, and I quote, "Victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment must always have their claims heard. They must never be silenced or intimidated into silence," end quote. Well, the Speak Out Act provides precisely that protection. And I strongly urge my colleagues to support this legislation, this bipartisan legislation that was passed unanimously in the Senate, that builds upon the great work of you, Madam Speaker, in H.R. 4445, so that once and for all, we can no longer provide protection to predators and abusers that are acting with impunity in workplaces all across America. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Gentlemen.